All right, Ravens flock, what's going on, everybody? Hope you guys are enjoying your day. So I've been watching a lot of Ravens games recently, and it's got me thinking about a lot of topics that I feel the need to discuss. Today's topic is going to focus on one Hollywood Brown, the former Ravens receiver that spent 3 years in Baltimore before ultimately being traded to the Arizona Cardinals on draft night. That was a crazy night. I'm never going to forget that night. That was truly crazy. But Hollywood Brown's time in Baltimore came to an end, and honestly, it's been quite the ride. Those 3 years were certainly interesting. One can argue that Hollywood Brown was the most talked about player not named Lamar Jackson in Baltimore. The flock really couldn't understand what to make of Hollywood Brown, and that was the main debate. We couldn't gauge what he was really bringing to the table in terms of ability, in terms of overall performance, in terms of potential. We did not know what to make of Hollywood Brown. We saw the highs and the lows of this man on the field. When we saw the highs, many believed that he had the potential to be our true number one receiver, that number one guy, that go-to guy we've been looking for in Baltimore for a long time. But when we saw the lows, when it came to him getting bullied by bigger physical corners, when it came to him not being able to really get open at times, when it came to him dropping open passes, when we saw that, many believe he can't be that guy. And that kind of split the fan base when it came to talking about Hollywood. There was a group of people that believed he could eventually be that guy, and there was a group of people that never bought into Hollywood Brown and never thought he was going to be that number one guy. They just thought he was going to be our deep threat, but he could never take that role of a number one receiver. So his 3 years here, we certainly discussed that, and it was an interesting conversation. But now he's no longer a Raven. So when we take those 3 years, I feel now that he's gone, we can look back at those 3 years and have a conversation. I gotta ask you, Ravens flock, when you take a look at the 3 seasons that he played here, how do you think Hollywood Brown's short career in Baltimore fares in Ravens receiver history? When you look back at all the receivers that were drafted, as well as the receivers that we brought in from free agency, how do you think Hollywood Brown's short career in Baltimore will fare compared to those other guys? Well, that's what we're going to discuss today. All right. So, I think I want to divide it into 2 sections. The sections of players that were drafted by Baltimore and the sections of players that were picked up via free agency. Obviously, we're not going to talk about everyone because when you look at the players the Ravens drafted, most of them didn't even work out, okay? So we're not going to bring up guys like Campanaro. We're not going to bring up some of those other guys that just didn't work out for us for the most part. Obviously, you know, the biggest one being Breshad Perriman, but we're not going to bring him up in terms of speaking on his time here. That one, we let that ship sail. I'm not going to bring up Breshad Perriman like that, but we will talk about at least the ones that were the highest of highs for our, in terms of who we drafted, even the recent ones too. So when you look at, we're going to look at the side of receivers that were drafted, and then we'll look at the sides of receivers that were brought in via free agency. So Hollywood Brown's career. In the 3 years he was here in Baltimore, he played 46 total games. He scored 21 touchdowns, had 2,361 total yards, and averaged 12 yards per catch throughout his 3 years here in Baltimore. How do we think that fares? Now, the journey with Hollywood was quite interesting because he actually took the league by storm low-key. Like, his debut in Baltimore, that first game in Miami, was what everybody was looking towards. We saw that performance by him and said, oh, him and Lamar could tear up this league if they really build up this deep threat duo. His first 2 catches were touchdowns. He had a 47-yard touchdown and then an 83-yard touchdown. And from there, we thought these guys were going to go off and be something special. Now, his rookie season, obviously, he was coming off of that injury when we first drafted him, so there wasn't a lot of expectations. But man, his rookie year, he didn't have a lot of yards, but he made some plays. He made some plays early on, and then down the stretch later on in the year, he made some plays as well. And then we got into the playoffs, that divisional game against the Tennessee Titans. He showed up. He showed up and made a lot of catches. And we saw that first year from Hollywood and said, you know what? He showed up in the he made some nice highlight plays in the regular season. Was pretty much one of the 2 or 3 guys that actually showed up offensively in that playoff game. All we need is for him to get healthy, have a year under his belt, come back next year and be even better. You get to the 2020 year, and his numbers do improve. Obviously, you're seeing the ascendance. He has more catches now, more yards, a higher yard per catch, and more total touchdowns. So it's just like you see, well, not more total, but more receiving touchdowns. Actually, he's more total because he doesn't even have rushing. But yeah, more total touchdowns in general. So his numbers took a leap. Not that much, but you did see the progress of Hollywood Brown that second year. So people were still liking what they were seeing. And again, we saw him in the playoffs against the Titans in the wildcard round. He showed up and made some nice catches. Once again, you're seeing him show the improvement in the regular season. And then in the postseason, he's the guy to show up. So we saw that there. And we expected him to take it to another level in his third year. And then in his third year, his numbers increase once again. He gets 91 catches this time, has over 1,000 yards. Now, the touchdowns is the lowest of the 3 years, but you still see he's making some improvement. And again, we do have to take into consideration that Lamar did miss the final 5 games. So losing Lamar definitely did hurt his numbers. He could have done much better had we not lost Lamar, but it is what it is. Either way, you saw his numbers improve. So that's an example of the talent that we saw, the ability and the performance, the highs of the highs. However, when you look at that, you also understand that this man had a lot of drop passes throughout these 3 years. And it couldn't be ignored. It could not be ignored. Those drop passes definitely hurt us because they were happening in key moments. Like one of the biggest drop passes we saw was in the Browns game in 2020 on Monday Night Football, in which he just dropped a pass that would have been the first down. That was when Trace McSorley was in because Lamar Jackson was in the locker room. Like he was just dropping open passes and people were losing their mind with Hollywood. Obviously, the worst of the worst in terms of him dropping passes was that game against the Lions last season where he dropped like 3 touchdown passes and it was unexcusable. But yeah, we saw those. That's a clear example of the lows. So we saw the highs and we saw the lows. Overall, he showed that he could be very productive. He could be our deep threat. And if him and Lamar had more time, they could have continued to build up the deep ball and the deep passing game and build that connection between them. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen. So taking a look at his numbers here, honestly, 3 years, 21 total touchdowns, 2,300 plus total yards, and 195 catches. That's pretty damn good. Considering what we've gotten from receivers we've drafted, that's one of the best we could get. Now, how does he fare? Well, I think it's pretty simple to say. You would probably put him second. In terms of the guys that we drafted in Baltimore, you would probably put him second. It's a clear consensus. It's a clear consensus here that Torrey Smith is the best receiver we've ever drafted. That is clear as day. No one's going to argue that. You could compare the numbers between Torrey Smith and Hollywood Brown, Torrey Smith's first 3 years versus Hollywood Brown's first 3 years, and have a conversation there. But Torrey Smith, he came in and immediately made an impact. Him and Flacco had a connection like that. And we saw that show up both in the regular and in the postseason. So I just believe Torrey Smith probably still holds the realm, or still holds the belt for being the best receiver the Ravens have ever drafted. That's a tough one to get past. And I don't think Hollywood Brown is going to be able to surpass that. He had an opportunity to, but he only played 3 years here. And honestly, no one else was really on his level in terms of the other guys we drafted. So I think it's safe to say he'd be second behind Torrey Smith. Because, you know, we had guys that just came in and just didn't, it didn't really work out. I will say this, though. When you look at the 2 guys we still have here in James Prochet and Devin Duvernay, hell, if you want to throw Tylan Wallace in, you can. Those guys still have an opportunity to surpass Hollywood Brown. And of course, Rashad Bateman has to be named because we believe he's going to be our number 1 guy. That doesn't even have to be discussed. We believe Rashad Bateman is, in fact, there's a good chunk of the Ravens flock that already believes he's better than Hollywood Brown. Like, the minute he was drafted, they said he was better than Hollywood Brown. People believe that from the start. Now, that's a discussion for another day. I'm not going to debate that here, whether or not you believe that. But everyone looked at Rashad Bateman and said, yep, he's going to be our number 1 guy. Even when Hollywood Brown was still here, people believed that Rashad was going to be that number 1 guy. So Rashad Bateman right now has the best chance to surpass Torrey Smith, at least in terms of the Ravens flock ties. We'll see how that works out. But right now, in terms of impact, yeah, I would still say Hollywood Brown's over the top because he's done more. But Rashad Bateman will have an opportunity now because he's going to be the number one guy. So in terms of how Hollywood Brown would fare in our drafted side of Ravens receivers, yeah, he'd be behind Torrey Smith, in my opinion. He would truly be behind Torrey Smith because, yeah, we just don't draft well with our receiving core. Torrey Smith was by far the best receiver we've ever drafted, and Hollywood Brown would be number 2. So you struck gold with Torrey Smith, you struck gold with Hollywood Brown. Unfortunately, he's not here anymore, but yeah, I think in terms of Ravens history, when it comes to drafting receivers, Hollywood Brown would be number 2, Torrey Smith will be number 1. Now, when it comes to our free agent receivers, that becomes a different conversation. Obviously, he would be better than guys like Michael Crabtree or John Brown. You could probably also throw in somebody like Mike Wallace. You could say, yeah, Hollywood Brown would definitely be ranked higher in that situation in terms of guys that came here and played. But when you look at the rest, when you look at somebody like a Derek Mason, I don't know if you could sit back and say Hollywood Brown would be ranked higher all time in the Ravens receiving history. I don't think you could say he's higher than Derek Mason because Mason was fantastic. Mason really was our number 1 receiver when he was here in Baltimore. Like, that's not a conversation. And he's so underrated. We don't really talk about Derek Mason's time in Baltimore because he was so underrated. But that guy was the number 1 receiver for us. Another name we throw out there, obviously, Anquan Boldin. Yeah, Hollywood Brown's not touching that. Hollywood Brown's not touching that. You know, Anquan Boldin also played 3 years here as well, but what he was able to accomplish in the 3 years here, especially in that Super Bowl run, yeah, it's impossible for Hollywood Brown to touch that. Technically, you could throw Jacoby Jones in. Then again, he was really there for the return game, not the receiving game. So if you want to say he's quote-unquote higher in terms of the receiving aspect, you could, but people probably aren't going to give him the nod because obviously we have the Mile High Miracle by Jacoby Jones, and that is probably enough for people to say, yeah, I'm putting him over Hollywood Brown. So you got somebody like that. You also got somebody like a Steve Smith Sr. who had an impact both in the regular and the postseason when we did have him that 1 year in the postseason. And then, you know, we had him in 2015, got injured. 2016, we didn't make the playoffs, but he was still making an impact there. But, you know, Steve Smith Sr. was at the end of his rope, so it's kind of tough to necessarily discuss him specifically. But, yeah, there are a couple guys that will probably be named. Yeah, Derek Mason, Anquan Boldin. If you want to throw in Jacoby Jones, even though he was there mostly for the return game as opposed to the receiving game, those 3 are going to be ranked higher in terms of the Ravens' history as a receivers as opposed to Hollywood Brown, so he wouldn't touch that. You can make an argument that he might be in front of Steve Smith Sr., but I'm not exactly sure if people are willing to give him that because even though Steve Smith Sr. was at the end of his career, that man was making a lot of plays for us. So he still played like a number 1 receiver, even though he was at the end of his ropes, you know. So it's very tough. Some people might be able to put him above Steve Smith Sr. I think it's probably safe to say he's going to be below because, I don't know, man. Steve Smith Sr., despite the fact that he was also a small receiver, that guy was one of the most physical guys to ever play this game. And his time in Baltimore it was definitely felt. It was just unfortunate that we just couldn't get back to the playoffs after 2014. It was tough. But yeah, in terms of our free agent receivers, I don't think Hollywood Brown would really rank high because we've hit on a couple guys that weren't the most talented, but in terms of impact, yeah, they definitely made more of an impact than Hollywood Brown in this 3 years. It's an interesting conversation, you know. I feel like it's unfair to talk about Hollywood Brown in terms of how he would rank with the free agent receivers, but if we're talking about how he's going to be fair with all Ravens receivers, you have to bring in the free agent one. That's why I wanted to separate it. If we're just talking about guys drafted, Hollywood Brown is the second best receiver we've ever drafted. That's not a conversation. Rashad Bateman has an opportunity to prove that he's that second one, and maybe it surpasses both Hollywood and Torrey Smith. He has an opportunity. He's going to show what he can do this year. But right now, I believe if we were to grade him, if we were to look at how he fared as a receiver for Baltimore, in terms of being drafted, he would be second behind Torrey Smith. In terms of free agents, he's not in the top 5. He just wouldn't be in the top 5 in this situation. Yeah, Derek Mason, Anquan Boldin, Jacoby Jones. Actually, yeah, you could probably put him at 5. You could probably put him at 5. Thinking about it now. Yeah, you probably could. Then again, I don't know how some people felt about Mike Wallace. I don't know. But you could, I definitely say you would put him at the 5. I thought there was another person I could name there at the time, but no. Derek Mason, Anquan Boldin, Jacoby Jones, Steve Smith Sr. Those are the 4 best receivers we've gotten out of free agency. And past that, yeah, Hollywood can be at 5. So if we're talking about him faring off in terms of free agent receivers, he'd be at 5. In terms of drafted receivers, he'd be number 2. And in terms of it being collective, obviously he's not in the top 5. He's not. So I don't think he would rank top 5 in terms of Ravens receivers in history, both free agents and drafted. So it's an interesting thought to really talk about here when we think about it, because I feel like I want to put him higher because he really showed some ability, but no, I don't think we can put him past those 5 guys. Those 5 guys are locked up in the top 5. Just Torrey Smith, Derek Mason, Anquan Boldin, Jacoby Jones, and Steve Smith Sr. Yeah, I don't think you can get past that. So yeah, I'm gonna put Hollywood Brown below the top 5 in totality. He would rank number 5 in terms of how he would fare with the free agents receivers we picked up, and he would rank number 2 in terms of drafted. He's the 2nd best receiver we've ever drafted. He probably will fall down depending on how Rashad Bateman pans out. We'll see how that works out. And who knows? Maybe if Duvernay and Prochet also fare out well, you'll see Hollywood Brown drop off even more. I don't know. But right now, in terms of where Hollywood Brown would fare all time when it comes to our Ravens receivers room, yeah, he'd probably be out of the top 5. Maybe number 6. You can put him number 6 or number 7. I think that's how he would rank all time. Number 6 or number 7. Anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say. There was no reason to make this video. I just felt the need to talk about it because it was a random thought that came to me when I was watching some of the old videos of Lamar and Hollywood Brown highlights. It came up. I was watching Lamar's MVP season and seeing some of the things Hollywood Brown did, and I was just thinking to myself, man, he was really our 2nd best receiver we've ever drafted. How would he really fare if we had a conversation about it? No context into this, just a fun video. Don't take it too seriously. We're just, making a discussion here. It is what it is. With that being said, that is all I've got, and I'm out of here, man. Peace.